As we begin the second half of our show today, we bring in Kurt Metzger, a demographer and founder of Data-Driven Detroit, with us on the MegaCast. Kurt, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I appreciate having you on. So for the first time in recorded history in the state of Michigan, we've had a year in 2020 with more deaths than births. Now, initially, knee-jerk reaction, the low-hanging fruit here is to assume that's because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Is that the case, or are there other reasons that are a greater factor behind that, or an additional factor behind what that statistic may be driven by?
Yes, there are other factors, and just to make the point that even taking the COVID deaths, at least as Michigan Department of Health and Human Services have coded them, if we took the COVID deaths out of the mix, we would still have more deaths than births in Michigan. So a lot of people who will say, okay, once COVID is done, this whole trend will be gone and everything will be fine. Not true at all. What's happening is we've been seeing this slow and steady decrease in births in the state, combined with a slow and steady increase in deaths. And this is, partially, talking the births overall, we're talking about lower birth rates. Women, certainly once education became more and more a factor, and women were going to college, going to graduate school, going to medical school, professional degrees, they have slowly but surely delayed marriage, and even with that, delayed further childbearing. And many are choosing not to. So what we've been seeing is this decrease in births. Michigan has even more of a factor because we lose so many of our young people are moving out. They're going to other states. So people in their childbearing years, women in their childbearing years, the numbers have been going down. The percentage of women in their childbearing years has been going down. So it's kind of that combination of we have fewer women in their childbearing years, plus we have a lower birth rate. So we're seeing this continuous drop. On the other side, we have an older population. Michigan is one of the aging states, fastest aging states, because of this loss of the young people, because of the lower births, and because we are majority white population, which is older. So Michigan is getting older. We have it's something like 25 counties in the state that have median ages above 50. When your median age is above 50, you're not having a lot of children. And so we've kind of been seeing this getting closer and closer. Back in 2019, there was only about an 8,000 difference between births and deaths. Back in 1990, there was a 75,000 difference. So you see this loss, and now 2020 just pushed it over the edge.
We're joined by Kurt Metzger, founder of Data-Driven Detroit, joining us on the MegaCast. And just for some reference here in the local area, Wayne and Genesee counties lost 1,269 and 1,220 people, respectively, followed by separately counted in the city of Detroit, not included in Wayne County's numbers, a 723 person loss in the city of Detroit. For reference of births versus deaths in Oakland County, a 609 person difference, more deaths than births here in Oakland County, where we originate our broadcast, and only for reference, 7 of Michigan's 83 counties saw an increase in population in the 2020 census results. And so that's kind of what we're looking into. And Kurt, also something that we saw a lot during the earlier portions of the COVID-19 pandemic, as people were either out of their jobs and looking for a change of scenery, or people were fed up with restrictions in the state of Michigan versus in other states in the region or across the U.S. A lot of people were moving as well. How much of a factor was people moving out of the state for a variety of different reasons in the changes of these numbers ultimately in the 2020 census?
Well, 2020, the state actually picked up a few people. It came actually a little bit higher than what we had anticipated. But since you know, that the problem with Michigan has always been that we send more people away to other states than we get in. We are an out-migrant state, so it varies based on the economy how many people we're losing, and certainly in recent years it's been much better. You know, our losses have been maybe averaging about 7,000 a year as opposed to back in recessions when we were losing up to 80,000 a year. So there's that. I mean, that obviously plays into it. Michigan is not able to attract younger people. And we're also, another factor is the number of immigrants. Michigan has been able to average about 18,000 immigrants a year directly. And then we get some secondary immigrants go to other states and then move to Michigan. Because of immigration numbers down, that additional factor to Michigan has dropped. So we're not getting the immigrant numbers that we used to. And immigrants tend to have, generally, they tend to come here in their childbearing years. They tend to be younger. And they also tend to have higher birth rates. So there are a number of factors that are just kind of playing against Michigan. And as you point out, I think a lot of people did leave. There is that hope that people who could do work remotely would be more apt to want to come to maybe Michigan because of our lakes and our climate and everything else. People who like that kind of living would be more apt to come to Michigan, but we're not seeing those numbers either. We are seeing them go. Minnesota has done a good job of attracting. Wisconsin has done a good job. So there are northern states that are able to attract and have been very good at attracting people because of winter sports and other kinds of activities. Michigan, even with pure Michigan and everything, we don't seem to have that same attraction. And again, as you said, 76 of the 83 counties had more deaths than births. Generally, we're seeing on an average year, we're seeing about 50 counties with more deaths than births. So, outside of, we have better than 2/3 of the state that's just more or less one county after another losing population, not being able to attract population. And so it just seems to me that the state has a lot of work to do to try to figure out how do we start to turn these trends around.
We're joined by Kurt Metzger, founder of Data Driven Detroit and also a demographer for Data Driven Detroit, joining us on the Megacast to talk about some of the changes in population recorded in 2020 U.S. Census data. And so taking all those factors into consideration and recognizing, as you said, some of the differences in the numbers in neighboring states in the region like Wisconsin and like Minnesota, is this commonality of is the commonality rather there in terms of neighboring states in our region having numbers like this in the past or in recent times? Given that Michigan, this is the first time since in its recorded history that they've recorded more deaths than births in the state. Is that something more common in other states in the region or across the board in the U.S., or is this something that is relatively rare across the board in recorded population numbers?
Well, it's become more common in basically states surrounding Michigan. I mean, it's more the Midwest and Northeast. So certainly Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, these are all primarily white. These are whiter states in terms of the population, which means that they're older. Again, they're the states that tend to be losing population or growing very slowly and certainly losing representation in Congress. So we are part of that. You're also seeing those in the northeastern United States where they're even a large, more white in terms of their population and also aging. So it is that, again, it's this, what we've been seeing nationally, the trends are population leaving the Midwest and the Northeast, heading south, heading southwest, heading west. Although you're seeing some interesting migration changes with a lot of people leaving California and heading to Montana and Nevada and to New Mexico and on and on. They're coming inland. A lot of that because of immigration and again, policies and other issues at the state level. But it tends to be, Michigan is not that unique in terms of its neighboring states. It's just that when you look at Michigan and you look at so much empty territory and so many counties that are just losing population, losing economic base, not being able to attract people, the question is what happens to the Upper Peninsula outside of Marquette and Houghton counties that have universities? All the other counties have been losing for quite a while. The same thing is if you look at the northeastern part of the Lower Peninsula and you look at those counties along the southern border of Michigan, they're all just kind of suffering. And we have all this land and everybody is obviously saying that by 2050, Michigan will be the magnet for all those, all the climate problems and people moving to Michigan because we will be the best state for climate. But in the meantime, we got 30 years to think about what are we going to do to try to re-engage the economies and try to get people moving into some of these areas that are slowly disappearing.
And so, Kurt, that brings up an interesting question too, because these drops in population, from the outside looking in, for someone that doesn't really understand the implications of that on a state level and certainly on a federal level, they may think, okay, we're going to lose a couple of seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. We have a slightly smaller population. Maybe our schools on the local level are going to lose some of that basic funding that they get from tax dollars in our city. But for places that are near major cities or in high population centers, that might not be as great of a factor to them as, like you said, those smaller cities in the Northern Peninsula, or even those smaller cities locally that have a lot of reliance on those federal dollars and those state dollars. So when we look at these population changes from 2010 to 2020 census and see some of those dips in numbers, particularly near those areas with smaller populations or less resources from the onset, despite the population, what kind of residual effects can that drop in population from a funding standpoint from the federal and state level have on those communities as their population dwindles?
Well, it certainly is going, as you say, I mean, federal funding, even federal funding that comes through the state and then is distributed, is based on census numbers in various aspects. So it's total population, it's poverty population, it's youth population, a number of other things. So obviously, as those numbers go down, the funding formulas kick in and the funding goes down as well. So as far as federal funds and even state funds, that's going to affect some of these areas. What the problem, in addition, is that Michigan doesn't seem to give up its own, everybody wants to have their own community. They want to have their own school district. They want to have, everybody, nobody's going to give up what they've got. And so you're seeing, even though the population has dropped, and especially the population in many of the areas of the state, school districts aren't disappearing. All these various areas that need funding keep advocating for money with decreasing populations. Something has to give. And I think, we're still, even in Southeast Michigan, we're, while we saw some more deaths than births this time around, we're still kind of holding our own. We're not growing quickly. We're kind of staying relatively constant. SEMCOG predicts a little bit of growth, but it's that kind of collaboration and that's working together. And I think it becomes more important that we start thinking about, do we start to collapse? Do we start to put school districts together? Do we need to start it's kind of this: how do regions start to work together? How do communities start to work together? We cannot afford to be independent operators, all fighting for limited dollars. Right now, the state's flush because of all the funds that have come from the feds. A couple years, those are going to be gone. What are we going to do about it? And I think that Michigan needs to look at these demographic trends and see how those are going to affect economic trends going forward. What is it going to mean when the state is distributing money? Are we going to keep sending money to the counties that are getting smaller and smaller? What do we start to do? And I think that needs to be, there's some hard decisions that need to be made.
Yeah, it brings up an interesting quandary, too, for those that are representing those smaller counties and those that are representing those counties that are seeing that slow growth still, but not significant growth in the future when they're making those decisions and discussing those decisions, particularly in budget discussions at the state level and at the federal level going forward. And so, of course, we're joined by Kurt Metzger, a demographer and founder of Data Driven Detroit, joining us on the Megacast. We recently, of course, had the release of the congressional maps for the state of Michigan, for State House and Senate, as well for the U.S. House. On top of that, by the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, of course, with residual lawsuits resulting from that as well, from those opposing their maps. That among those, the Detroit Caucus's lawsuit has been dropped by the Michigan Supreme Court. That happened earlier on this week. When you study these maps, what do you think about the job that the commission has done in providing new maps for the next 10 years that are properly representing the populations of these given areas, especially given the changes that Michigan's population has undergone, particularly the changes in the diversity of the state of Michigan's population?
Well, the one thing I want to do is congratulate the commission and also give credit to the state of Michigan for trying to get rid of political gerrymandering and take it out of. So, for Michigan, which tends to follow the trends most often, this was something that showed us to be quite at the head of the class, more or less, to put it together. And so, when you look at also when you start looking at the distribution of diversity in this region, and you, particularly in this region, you see it in other areas, but more Southeast Michigan, and then in particular cities, maybe Flint, Saginaw Bay, Muskegon, a couple, but those are still fairly small populations of minority groups. I think the question, and I still have some concerns about this idea that the commission was told that African Americans could elect their preferred candidate with a 40% or 40 to 45% of the district. I'm not so sure of that, and I think that the data that were used were so limited and were not strong enough to really make those kinds of opinions. So I think that that's going to be problematic. And certainly when you look at the districts, there are very few districts within Detroit, and certainly that's partially attributable to the fact that Detroit's population keeps getting smaller and smaller. It can't even in and of itself be one congressional district, even if they wanted to. And when you start looking at the state house and state senate, the fact is you've had a lot of migration out of the city into the suburbs. So, and we're seeing that in other parts of the state, that we don't have those concentrations necessarily, that there is a much greater movement. And so the districts had to take that into account. I think that they could have run the percentage of African Americans up a little bit in some, that they really did cut the number of minority districts. But I have to, and I do, when I looked at the U.S. congressional districts, in Oakland County is part of 6 of them, seems a little bit much. It's cutting up the county a little more than I would necessarily think is necessary. But I think they did overall, I have to say that they did a great job. And I think that they have by all measures, they have cut down the preference, the party preference in terms of the way the numbers played out, just kind of putting back voting patterns on top of the new districts. I mean, I have to believe that they've done a pretty good job. I know that people are not going to be happy in certain areas, but you can't please everybody. I think for a first shot at this, and for 11, what was it? Oh, what was it, 11 people, 13 people? Can't remember. Who had no experience in any of this before. I think they did a marvelous job.
We're joined by Kurt Metzger, demographer and founder of Data Driven Detroit. Kurt, thank you very much for joining us and talking over this complicated information. That it's really interesting when you dive into these numbers and you consider some of the factors that went into these changes, what these changes may be indicating for the future as well. You can really get into a long conversation about where Michigan's population is right now and where we're going to go in the future. And of course, those additional implications that all that data has on things like our representation in government through new systems like the Michigan Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission. Anything else for us today before we let you go, Kurt?
No, and I just appreciate the fact that you see that data are important, and I just feel that we need to look at this information. This is something that is a trend that isn't about to change unless we do something very drastic, and that the state of Michigan and local leaders and others need to start looking at data and trying to understand what does it tell us. What does it tell us about what's going on now? But as you said, particularly, what do we do about the future? These are not trends that are going to change on their own. This is something that Michigan needs to start taking seriously. And again, we need to start taking seriously. Do we need all these independent school districts, communities? We need to start thinking better. How do we govern, and what are we looking toward the future? And this is for Oakland County, but it's for the state as a whole. I think leadership needs to start paying much more attention to these numbers.
Kurt, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.